So when most people think about the Middle Ages, they think of Europe. They don't really think about the rest of these areas, but all of these areas kind of came together because of what was happening in the European systems. So following Rome's fall, Christianity started to appeal to a lot of Europeans because the Middle Ages were a time that was filled with doubt, suffering, hardship, and so a lot of them found comfort in religion, which was why Charlemagne was able to use it to his advantage. Charlemagne became the emperor of the Roman Empire, and he unified Rome for the first time since the fall of Rome. He also became known as the Holy Roman Empire, and so his empire was no longer known as the Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire because the Pope granted him that title. Charlemagne ordered a lot of schools to start in which students were now studying religion, music, grammar, and other subjects, which led to a lot of the spread of education. He also created a unified Christian empire by forcing those that he conquered to convert to Christianity. This included a lot of those Middle Eastern countries. He also developed a written legal code based on tribal laws that he took over and Christian teachings. Feudalism also began to develop in Europe. Feudalism is a political and social system of land for service. A person who owned the land became the lord, and the person who accepted the land became the vassal. And those lands were known as fiefs. Kings who owned the land hired knights to defend them and paid for their services through these gifts of land, and then they became landowners, aka lords, and then they also had to use these lands for serfs. The feudal system, it was related to the economic system, the manorial system, in which lords exchanged services and plots of lands to farm for labor. So feudalism is really the social structure, and the manorial system is really the economic tiers that kind of happen, those exchanges. So the lords lived in these manor houses. They paid serfs to work their land, who they were legally tied to the manor. And the manors also had free people in them, like blacksmiths who rented the land from the lord. So in England, it was one of the first countries to develop a really strong central monarchy. But a lot of the nobles had become a little bit nervous about the power because they feared that the king would abuse his power. And so the nobles started writing a document called the Magna Carta that restricted the king's power. And this was a huge deal because it was the first time in which somebody had started to limit the executive power of the king. Nobles also created parliament because they didn't think the Magna Carta would be enough. And so the parliament became a council of nobles, clergy, and the middle class. Then they met and discussed important issues with the king and tried to persuade him on one way or another. During this time, the Crusades were also taking place because Christians were hoping to win back the Holy Land from the Muslims because that was where the Ottoman Empire had been. Crusaders also tried to get rid of the Muslims in Spain in a move called the Reconquista. The Crusades mostly just increased trade between the Christian and Muslim empires as they gained new goods the Muslims had that they didn't. There was also an increased knowledge of Muslims, and so they started to respect other cultures. However, along the way, they didn't just defeat all of the Muslims, they also became very violent toward other religions, such as Jews. So also in Europe during this time, trade in towns started to emerge. Agriculture wasn't necessarily as big of a thing anymore, and so they started to form these towns. As trade grew, large cities like London became more common. Coins became the currency, and some merchants allowed credit, and the first banks emerged. New farming technologies also led to more people moving to cities because fewer people were needed for labor. And also as the Black Plague hit, there were also the collapse of the feudal system, which would lead to the development of these towns. So in order to protect themselves, craftsmen organized themselves into guilds. They were really trying to protect themselves from competition, as well as making sure that they had a set prices and standards for products. During the Middle Ages, there was a very specific culture that formed. Many of these Gothic structures that we see and know, such as the one on the right, we see all these arches, very intricate building shapes, flying buttresses. Many of the writings from the Middle Ages had to do with religion because Christianity was a super important part of the Middle Ages. European universities also started to grow toward the end of the Middle Ages, which increased a lot of knowledge of science, philosophy, and would lead us into the Enlightenment era. Meanwhile, there was also battles happening over power between the English and the French. This was really the beginning of the English and French rivalries. When the French king died, there was conflict over who should take over his throne. Obviously, the English wanted to take it over because they felt like, well, it's our land. We want to expand our influence. But there was also another guy who wanted to take it over. The English King Edward, he tried to claim his right, and so he actually started the 100 Years' War, and guess what? It lasted 100 years. So the French were finally able to push the English out over the course of 100 years. So toward the end of all of this in the feudal system, a major plague took over Europe called the Black Death. It was devastating. It ended up wiping out 1/3 of the population of China and Europe. It originated in Asia and then eventually would move to Europe via trade. The Black Death was always fatal, and it was characterized by these large black spotches, aka Black Death. People started to blame God for the plague, and so they turned to witchcraft, and they started to question the things that they knew and loved. Based on the loss of population because so many people died, the plague also ended the manor system, and people started moving to towns.